Okay, so HST 322, week 4, audio 3. Let's finish up this baby. We're on slide 20. So did I say Japanese influence? So when the Japanese first seriously tested Korea's open door policy, they came with much more force than these little tinkerings by the French and the Americans. And again, please think about geopolitical reality. A shorter Japanese logistical tail, very easy to ship large numbers of troops to a nearby battle zone if you're Japan. If we're talking about Korea or China, the logistical tail from Britain or America is huge. The Kanghwa Treaty, this is a Korean word, a Korean place name, Kanghwa. The Kanghwa Treaty was Korea's first with a foreign country. It resulted in a de facto, which means in fact, a de facto removal of Korea from the Chinese tribute system. But the Koreans did not realize this. They didn't realize it because they thought they could continue to move things ahead as they had in the past with a tribute relation with China. China would continue to protect us to some degree. We can continue to control our foreign trade in ways we did before. But the Qing, the Chinese, did realize that this was a big problem. Their lead diplomat, Li Hongzhang, devised, apparently with his staff, a strategy for Korea to strengthen herself by cultivating, as he put it, intimate relations with China, coordination with Japan, alliance with America, and caution toward Russia. Very interesting ideas. Another potential extra credit paper. Please read the notes below on this slide in the PowerPoint file. So the U.S. succeeded in reaching the first open ports treaty with Korea. First open ports, and when I say that, what does that mean? That means we have a treaty between our two countries that allows both of us to trade without problems in the ports of the other country. Just normal immigration controls, passports, visas, that sort of thing, payment of taxes, and so on. No freezing out foreign vessels from ports, an open port treaty. In 1882, the U.S. reached this open port treaty with Korea. And just as happened in Japan after the Perry visit, 1852, and the Harris Treaty that followed, other nations joined the queue. So this period, this decade, 1876 to 86, and then the 10 more years that followed after that, saw a gradual increase and eventual escalation of alarm in the understanding of the foreign threat by all factions of people of Yongbang in Seoul, the capital, but really no development of unity. Instead, the factions had the support of Japan or China, while King Kojong actually sought the advice for a time from an American minister. It is periods like this described in Robinson and Kim that make many people in Korea think that there is this unfortunate national tendency to rely on foreigners during times of national difficulty. People start to think about nasty traitors and very black and white sort of historical narratives, bad movies, bad guys, good guys, this sort of thing. And the truth I think is more nuanced. We should note that the overwhelming strength of external rival powers surrounding Korea and the geographical misfortune of the Korean peninsula to lie in between these stronger powers is not an easy situation to deal with for any peoples. In any case, the Chinese held their own in this struggle. In that first decade, and in 1884, a coup occurred that almost brought China and Japan to war 10 years before they actually fought. And the two nations agreed on a mutual military withdrawal of troops from Korea, because up until in the couple of years leading up to 1884, they were gradually building up their forces in anticipation of a fight. You'll remember this was the period when the Chinese had beaten away the French from invading from Indochina, invading Yunnan province in China's southeast. And so the Chinese were obviously looking at the situation and thinking, well, if we can keep the French out, then we can probably keep the Japanese out of Korea. But neither side really wanted a war at this point. There was an additional problem too in Korea. Christianity was coming in greater force, because there was a loss of control of immigration during this time. And missionaries were coming in. They were setting up hospitals and schools. And this made the situation seem even less stable than it was. Let's go on to slide 22. At least I hope this is slide 22. This is the slide that says Korea, north and south at night. Again, that's Korea, north and south at night. So just as an aside, I want to show you that this very interesting illustration, satellite photograph, showing North Korea to be dark, except for Pyongyang, which is in the west there, and Hamhong, which is in the northeast along the coast. Very interesting how well lit China is, especially along its coast, how exceedingly well lit is Seoul, which is the great big white spot there in South Korea, and everything along the coast, and how dark is North Korea. Going on to the next slide, which says the Tonghak Rebellion and Kabul Reforms. So this movement, called the Eastern Learning, or Tonghak, it would be Dongxue in Chinese, Tonghak. You can hear there's a similarity there. This is one of the Sinitic words in Korean, which is not a Sinitic language. It's a word borrowed from the Chinese. This Eastern Learning, or Tonghak, had begun decades before, in the 1850s and 60s. It was condemned by the king's government. It advocated, there was sort of like the Taiping Rebellion in a sense. They advocated egalitarianism, abolition of the Yangban aristocracy, ended discrimination by sex, increased rights for women, and some similar ideas to the Taiping Rebellion. The movement had grown by the early 1890s. It pressurized the government to vindicate its founder, the Tonghak, that is, to not prosecute him, not chase him around. Having no satisfaction and now being in a position to challenge the government, however, the Tonghaks revolted and established themselves in the southwest. This is Chola Namdo, Chola South Province, in today's geography, which was a place where there was a major rebellion in 1979 after a military coup. China and Japan had as well, so the hotbed of sedition there in the southwest. China and Japan had agreed not to send troops back into Korea, but the Chinese soon did so anyway because they feared loss of their buffer state. Japan sent in more, and we're talking now about 1894, and the two countries suddenly found themselves at war. And Korea had become a shrimp between two whales in the Korean account of things, a way of referring to themselves in this awful geopolitical situation, a shrimp between two whales. The Japanese won that war, and pro-Japanese reforms followed Tokyo's victory. But they did not yet completely take over Korea. Next slide, that says China's self-strengthening movement, 1861 to 95. Now this is a long period, and it was an interesting movement. Another potential extra credit paper topic. Write about the major elements of the self-strengthening movement and analyze why they were important. The Chinese had been engaged in reforms for 3 decades. As I say, a long period, from the 1860s all the way to 1895. And of course, 1895 is the year that they lost that war with Japan. The Chinese self-strengthening movement was not entirely in vain. It enabled them to build a navy that outnumbered Japan's, although it turned out to be less maneuverable, slower on the water, and not as fast at firing as the enemy. And indeed, the problem, I think we talked about this last week, the problem with the Chinese Navy was, were these things I just listed, but it was also that the Chinese Navy had no unified command organization, being another major modernization item. The Chinese Navy did not have unified command, and half of it was in the south, in Fujian, and the military leadership down there decided not to come to the aid of the Northern Fleet. Had they done so, there would have been twice as many Chinese ships in the water, and the battle may have been much different with the Japanese. The battle on the ocean would have been much different. And so as the situation became worse and worse, a new Chinese emperor came to power. His reign name, R-E-I-G-N, his reign name was Guangxu. And so he's called the Guangxu Emperor. The Guangxu Emperor had just attained his majority in 1898. In other words, he was officially an adult and was entitled to sit on the throne and receive memoranda and make decisions. He was a fan of the reformer Kang Youwei. And Kang Youwei was a prolific writer about China's inability to defend itself, even after 3 decades of self-strengthening. Kang advocated more vigorous reforms that closely paralleled those of the Japanese Meiji Restoration that had begun, of course, about 3 decades before. However, the Empress Cixi, you saw her in her last moments in the movie The Last Emperor. The Empress Cixi, or the Dowager Empress, was the person who really controlled the imperial government because she had placed all of the important officials in their positions, and they owed her. This is this idea of a pyramid of a strong person who leads others at the top and maintains influence through personal relations is much stronger in China and in the rest of Asia, indeed, than it is in the West. In any case, Cixi was not interested in seeing these reforms carried out because they would have included abolishing the Confucian exam system, abolishing the power of people who were beholden to her, and she arrested the Guangxu Emperor and imprisoned him in the Forbidden City, the emperor's the royal palace equivalent in the middle of Beijing, on an island in one of the lakes. You'll find a lot of attention given to this topic in the Westad readings, beginning on page 97. Let's go on to the next slide, where you see a picture of the lady herself, the Empress Cixi. It's spelled 2 different ways, depending on how old the book is you're looking at. If Cixi, painted here in one of her happier moods, I guess, had been influential at a time other than this, where foreign power was at the gates all over the place and new thinking was desperately needed, she might have had a positive place in Chinese history, but she is viewed today in a much less than positive light. I include this painting, which I used to see in graduate school because it was hanging in the East Asian Library in the lunchroom, not only because it helped me lose weight, but you can see that the artist, I think he was Dutch, was using standard light and shading techniques in painting this portrait. When it was unveiled for Her Highness, she almost had the artist executed because she said he had painted her with dark skin, which by that she meant the shadow. Going on. We're on the next to last slide now, where it says Chinese society really starts to unravel. So the merchant class was now in its most influential period possibly in Chinese history. Previously despised. Important to foreign interests like Jardine Matheson and the other big Hongs, as they were called, the other big corporations from foreign countries. This whole thing about merchants, by the way, it's an old-fashioned idea that merchants are a despised class, but it has survived into modern times. Most people don't think like this anymore. But back when I was your age, in the 1970s, and I went to Taiwan to study Chinese, this idea that people who do business were really scum was very common among educated people. It was in its last days, but it was still there. It's relatively rare now, but it's an idea that is not all that old. Well, it didn't go away very long ago, and perhaps it will return if you look at the very durable corruption that exists in China today. Perhaps people will start thinking that way again before long. Confucian learning remained ascendant, but it became less and less important as the dynasty died out, and eventually the Confucian exams in 1905 were abolished by the Empress herself, who was starting to come around, but was a day late and a dollar short, to say the least. Foreign religion was spreading all over China, and missionaries were now living basically wherever they wanted, as long as they could survive. And sometimes they didn't, because again, there was great dislike of foreigners amongst many Chinese, not among every single one of them, but amongst many. There were more and more Chinese, Westad talks a lot about this, more and more Chinese were going overseas and coming back with money, coming back with ideas. There was a two-way exchange of both money, people, ideas, technologies. And we were just getting into, as the 1890s turned to the 1900s, into the worst of the century of humiliation. And speaking of the century of humiliation, let's go to the last slide that says Foreign Presence in China, 1879 to 2010. So this is a really busy sort of thing, but if you look at it closely, you can see a pattern that's very important. The number of foreigners and their businesses in China was taking off like a rocket in 1911 when the Qing dynasty ended. This number grew and grew as China entered its most chaotic period in recent times, which was the period of the Chinese Revolution, 1911 to 1949. The Chinese Revolution, 1911 to 49, included two overlapping periods, you might call them. The Chinese Communist Revolution from 1927 to 1949, and the, of course, extremely devastating anti-Japanese War, 1937 to 45, and the Chinese Civil War, which was really the last phase of the communist nationalist struggle, 1945 to 49. Chinese security officials today, thinking about foreign threat, must not miss the association between the extreme chaos of the 1920s and 30s and the large number of foreigners peaking the way it did in China. And now, foreign residents and businesses are at an all-time high again. The presence of outsiders was obviously not the only cause of damage to the country during the Chinese Revolution, although it's often cited by Chinese, especially bloggers, as the source of various ills. In any case, next week we will examine the Chinese Revolution and the defeat of Japan and this enormous suffering which occurred during this period and remains very, very prominent in the popular imagination of China today. Thanks for listening.